Triceratops' calf befriends a human, then does something unforgettable. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun hung low over the golden fields, casting long shadows as Daniel trudged through the tall grass, his boots crunching softly against the earth. He was a paleontologist turned wildlife researcher, fascinated by prehistoric creatures ever since a groundbreaking experiment in de-extinction had changed the world forever. Dinosaurs, long thought extinct, had been reintroduced into the wild through advanced cloning technologies, making it possible to witness them not just as fossils, but as living, breathing animals. Daniel had spent years studying the herbivorous species, particularly the Triceratops, marveling at how they adapted to modern ecosystems. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. As he walked along a winding trail through the valley, a rustling noise caught his attention. He stopped in his tracks, heart pounding. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound, his eyes scanning the horizon. And then, from between the swaying ferns, a small, brownish-red creature emerged. It was a baby Triceratops. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he observed the calf, barely the size of a Labrador. Its tiny horns had not yet fully developed, and its frill was still soft and flexible. The creature let out a soft, high-pitched call, its deep golden eyes filled with curiosity. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, cautiously, Daniel knelt, extending his hand. He had no idea if the calf would trust him, but he knew that sudden movements could startle young dinosaurs. The calf sniffed the air, hesitated, then took a tentative step forward. Daniel held his breath. Another step, then another. Soon, the baby Triceratops was standing directly in front of him, its small nostrils flaring as it inspected his outstretched fingers. Daniel could hardly believe what was happening. This was the closest he had ever been to a wild Triceratops. And then, something even more unexpected occurred. The calf nudged his hand gently with its snout. A rush of warmth flooded Daniel's chest as he realized the significance of this moment. The baby was seeking comfort, and despite its prehistoric ancestry, it was acting just like a lost fawn looking for protection. "Hey there, little guy," Daniel murmured softly. The calf let out a low, warbling sound, pressing its head against his palm. It was alone. Daniel glanced around, searching for signs of a larger Triceratops. Its mother, perhaps, but the landscape was eerily quiet. No rustling of leaves, no deep, guttural calls from a nearby herd. That was strange. Baby Triceratops rarely wandered far from their groups, especially without an adult watching over them. Something was wrong. Daniel reached for his radio, his mind already racing through possibilities. Had the calf been abandoned? Had its mother been attacked? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Despite their size and armor-like frills, Triceratops were vulnerable to larger predators, especially when separated from their herds. As he pressed the button on his radio, a sudden rustling in the bushes made him freeze. Something or someone was nearby. He gently placed his hand on the calf's head, as if silently reassuring it to stay still. The little dinosaur nuzzled into his side, its small body trembling. Then the rustling grew louder. Daniel braced himself. The rustling in the bushes grew louder, and Daniel instinctively placed himself between the baby Triceratops and whatever was approaching. His heart pounded as he scanned the dense foliage. Was it a predator, a scavenger, or something even worse, poachers? He reached for the tranquilizer pistol holstered on his belt, not willing to take any chances. The calf let out a soft, frightened whimper and pressed itself closer to him. It was shaking. Whatever was coming, it was enough to unsettle the baby dinosaur. That made Daniel even more nervous. A shadow shifted through the trees. Then, in a blur of motion, something lunged. Daniel barely had time to react as a massive creature burst through the undergrowth, snarling. It was a raptor, sleek, agile, and terrifyingly fast. The velociraptor locked its golden eyes onto them. Its long, curved claws gleamed in the sunlight, and its nostrils flared as it caught their scent. It was hunting, Daniel swallowed hard. He knew he couldn't outrun it. Velociraptors were apex predators, intelligent, strategic, and relentless. Even a lone raptor was dangerous, but where there was one, there were often others. The baby Triceratops let out a panicked bleat and tried to back away, but Daniel held his ground. The raptor circled them, its muscles rippling beneath its scaly skin. It tilted its head, assessing the situation. Daniel slowly reached for the tranquilizer gun. He had only one shot. If he missed, he wouldn't get a second chance. The raptor hissed, crouching low. Daniel's finger tightened around the trigger. Then, out of nowhere, the baby Triceratops did something unbelievable. Charged. With an ear-piercing cry, the tiny dinosaur lowered its head and sprinted straight at the velociraptor. Its little horns pointed forward. It was an instinctive move, the same defensive tactic used by its ancestors millions of years ago. The raptor, clearly not expecting such aggression from a baby, hesitated just long enough for Daniel to act. He fired. The dart hit its mark, sinking into the raptor's side. The predator let out a guttural screech, stumbled, and thrashed violently. Within seconds, the tranquilizer took effect, and the raptor collapsed onto the ground, unconscious. Daniel exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. The baby Triceratops stood its ground, panting, its frill puffed up in a defensive display. Daniel knelt beside it, running a hand over its bony crest. "That was incredibly brave, little guy," he whispered, still in shock over what had just happened. The calf let out a small, triumphant sound and nuzzled against him. But the danger wasn't over yet. Velociraptors never hunted alone. A second rustling came from the bushes. Daniel felt his stomach drop. More were coming, and this time they wouldn't be caught off guard. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as the second rustling grew closer. The baby Triceratops pressed itself against him, its tiny frame trembling with fear. He had barely taken down the first velociraptor. What were the odds he could do it again? He quickly checked the tranquilizer gun. One dart left. That wasn't enough if more raptors were coming. His mind raced for options. Running was pointless. Climbing a tree? No use, raptors could jump. Then the bushes exploded. A second velociraptor emerged. But this one was different. It wasn't alone. Two more raptors flanked it, their sharp talons clicking against the dirt as they stalked forward. Their eyes locked onto him, then flicked to the unconscious pack member lying at their feet. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air. Daniel could see the calculation in their eyes, the way they moved in unison. They weren't just predators, they were strategists. The leader of the trio let out a sharp bark, and in an instant, the two raptors split up. One circled to the left, the other to the right. Classic pack hunting tactics. They were trying to corner him.
Daniel took a slow, steady breath and tightened his grip on the tranquilizer gun. He had one shot, but he needed to make it count. The lead raptor lunged. Daniel fired. The dart struck the creature in the neck, and it let out a furious screech, thrashing violently. But unlike the first raptor, this one didn't go down immediately. It fought the effects, shaking its head, resisting the tranquilizer. The other two raptors seized the moment. They attacked. Daniel barely managed to spin out of the way as razor-sharp claws swiped through the air where he had just been standing. He stumbled back, shielding the baby Triceratops behind him. It wasn't enough. One of the raptors lunged. But just before it could reach Daniel, the baby Triceratops let out a loud, defiant roar and did something incredible. It charged again. But this time it wasn't just a blind, panicked rush. It lowered its tiny horns and aimed directly for the raptor's legs. The impact wasn't strong enough to do serious damage, but it was enough to knock the predator off balance. The raptor stumbled, caught off guard, giving Daniel just enough time to grab a large rock from the ground. With everything he had, he slammed the rock into the raptor's side. The creature shrieked and scrambled away, retreating a few feet. But the second raptor was still coming. Daniel barely had time to react before it leaped into the air, its talons aimed straight for his throat. A blur of brown and green streaked past him. The baby Triceratops threw itself between him and the raptor. The raptor's claws raked across the calf's thick frill, but the bony shield absorbed most of the impact. The calf stumbled, letting out a pained cry, but it didn't back down. Daniel saw his chance. He lunged forward and slammed the rock into the second raptor's head. The creature let out a strangled gasp, staggered back, and then bolted into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Silence. Daniel's chest heaved as he clutched the baby Triceratops, making sure it was still standing. The little dinosaur was panting, its sides heaving from exhaustion, but it was alive. They had won. But then, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees. Daniel turned, his stomach twisting into knots. A fourth velociraptor. But this one was different. It was massive, larger than the others. An alpha. Its piercing yellow eyes locked onto them, and for the first time, Daniel felt true dread. They weren't going to survive this one. The baby Triceratops pressed against him, whimpering as the raptor crouched, preparing to strike. Daniel braced himself. And then, the ground rumbled. A deep, powerful growl shook the air. Something enormous was coming. The velociraptor hesitated, its gaze flicking toward the trees. Then, with a sudden shriek, it turned and fled. Daniel barely had time to process what had scared it off before a massive shadow emerged from the jungle. A towering figure stepped forward. A full-grown Triceratops. The calf let out a small, hopeful cry, and in an instant, the adult dinosaur rushed toward them, lowering its enormous head to nuzzle the baby. Daniel exhaled in pure relief. They had been saved. But the question remained, where had this adult Triceratops come from? And was it alone? The massive Triceratops lowered its head, nudging the calf protectively. The baby let out a soft chirping sound, pressing its snout against the adult's thick armor-like skin. Relief washed over Daniel, but he knew better than to let his guard down just yet. He took a cautious step back, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. The adult Triceratops fixed its massive, golden eyes on him. There was intelligence in that gaze, far more than what most people believe dinosaurs to be capable of. It studied him, its nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. The air was thick with tension, the jungle silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, the Triceratops let out a low, rumbling sound, not a roar, not a growl, but something almost gentle. It stepped closer, towering over him, its bulk nearly blocking out the sky. The baby Triceratops chirped excitedly, rubbing its head against his leg as if to say, "See? He's safe." Daniel swallowed hard. He had encountered dinosaurs before, but nothing like this. It was as if this creature could sense that he had protected its young. The Triceratops took another step forward and did something Daniel never expected. It knelt. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had seen elephants bow their heads in recognition before, but a dinosaur? This was unheard of. He could feel the ground tremble beneath its sheer weight. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and placed a hand on the massive creature's forehead. The skin was rough, textured like tree bark, warm beneath his fingers. The moment was cut short by a sudden crash in the underbrush. Daniel spun around, his pulse spiking. The jungle had gone deathly still again, but he knew better than to assume they were alone. The Triceratops let out a warning snort, lifting its head. Its muscles tensed, ready for battle. Then, without warning, the underbrush exploded outward. A velociraptor lunged, but not just any raptor, it was the alpha. The same massive creature that had retreated earlier. But this time it wasn't alone. Two more raptors flanked it, their sickle claws glinting as they advanced. Daniel barely had time to react before the alpha struck. It moved like a blur, faster than anything he'd seen before. Claws slashed toward him, but at the last second, the Triceratops moved. With a speed that seemed impossible for something so massive, the Triceratops swung its massive frill, knocking the raptor clean off its feet. The predator slammed into a tree with a sickening crack, dazed but not out. The other two raptors hesitated, their heads flicking between their fallen leader and the towering herbivore that now stood between them and their prey. The baby Triceratops let out a fierce screech and stomped its tiny foot, trying to imitate its protector. Daniel almost laughed despite the chaos. Then the alpha raptor staggered to its feet. Blood dripped from its mouth, but its eyes burned with fury. It let out a piercing shriek, signaling the others to attack. The two flanking raptors lunged, one toward Daniel, the other toward the baby. Daniel barely managed to dive out of the way as claws slashed through the air where he had just been standing. He rolled to the side, grabbing for his tranq gun, but his fingers found only dirt. He had lost it in the scuffle. The second raptor closed in on the baby. The Triceratops reacted instantly. With a furious bellow, it swung its massive horns, catching the raptor in the ribs. The impact sent the predator tumbling through the air. It hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. But the alpha raptor was still standing. And it was angry. It let out another shriek and charged straight for the baby Triceratops. Daniel's stomach lurched. He had no weapon, no way to stop it. Then the baby did something incredible. It charged. With its tiny horns angled forward, it met the raptor head-on. The impact wasn't strong enough to do real damage, but it was enough to make the predator stumble. And that was all the adult Triceratops needed. With an earth-shaking roar, it reared up on its hind legs and brought its front feet down, hard. The ground cracked beneath the force. The alpha raptor tried to dodge, but it was too late. One massive foot landed directly on its tail, pinning it down. The predator screeched in agony, thrashing wildly.
The other two raptors saw what was happening and made a run for it, disappearing into the jungle. The alpha let out a final, desperate cry, but it was over. The Triceratops twisted its head, its massive horns flashing in the dim light. And then, with one final, powerful swing, it gored the raptor through the chest. The predator let out a strangled hiss, then went still. Silence fell over the jungle. Daniel exhaled, his entire body shaking. He turned to the Triceratops, still stunned by what he had just witnessed. The dinosaur let out a victorious snort, then lowered its head to check on the baby. The calf, despite everything, seemed unharmed. If anything, it looked proud. It nuzzled against the larger Triceratops, chirping happily. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. "You two make a hell of a team." The adult Triceratops turned its gaze back to him. For a moment, it simply watched him. Then, in an almost deliberate gesture, it nodded. Daniel blinked. That had been a clear sign of acknowledgement. Thank you. He had spent years studying dinosaurs, but never had he seen anything like this. These creatures weren't just surviving, they were learning. But the moment was short-lived. In the distance, the sound of helicopters echoed through the trees. Reinforcements were coming. Daniel knew what that meant. If they found the Triceratopses here, if they saw what they had done, there was only one outcome: capture, containment, or worse. He couldn't let that happen. He turned to the Triceratops, his heart pounding. "You need to go. Now!" The dinosaur hesitated. The baby whined, not wanting to leave, but the adult seemed to understand. It let out a soft grunt, then nudged the calf toward the trees. The baby let out a small cry of protest, but after a moment, it turned and followed. Daniel watched as they disappeared into the jungle, vanishing like ghosts into the green. The sound of helicopters grew louder. He took a deep breath, bracing himself. By the time the team arrived, there would be nothing left to find. Nothing except an unconscious raptor, a broken jungle, and the legend of a man who had once stood beside giants. And in the end, that was exactly how it should be. As the sound of helicopters drew closer, Daniel took a final glance at the spot where the Triceratops and her calf had vanished into the jungle. He could still hear the faint rustling of leaves as they moved deeper into the dense foliage, retreating into safety. He had bought them some time, but not much. Daniel turned to the fallen alpha raptor. The creature was still motionless, its chest barely rising and falling. It was injured, but not dead. If the incoming team found it, they would take it back to the facility for study, containment, or worse. He hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. Kneeling beside the raptor, he pressed 2 fingers to its neck, feeling the steady, if weak, pulse beneath its scaly skin. He had spent years studying these creatures, but this was different. This was survival. He pulled out a small medical kit from his pack and quickly injected a mild sedative into the raptor's system. If it woke up too soon, it would be frantic, possibly violent. The sedative would buy him time to make sure the rest of the team didn't find it. The ground trembled slightly as the first helicopter hovered overhead. Leaves and dirt whipped through the air as searchlights cut through the jungle, illuminating the chaos of the battle that had just taken place. Daniel stood quickly, brushing off his hands just as the first group of armed men emerged from the tree line. "Dr. Calloway," a familiar voice called. Daniel turned to see Agent Riker stepping forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Behind him, more agents poured into the clearing, weapons raised, ready for an unseen threat. "What the hell happened here?" Riker demanded, taking in the torn-up ground, the broken trees, and the motionless raptor. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to calm his nerves. I was tracking a juvenile Triceratops when this raptor attacked. There was a struggle. Riker crouched next to the raptor, prodding its limp body with his gloved hand. And this? You took down an alpha raptor by yourself? He raised a skeptical eyebrow. Daniel shrugged. I got lucky. Riker's gaze hardened. I don't believe in luck, Calloway. Before Daniel could respond, another voice interrupted. Sir, tracks. One of the soldiers pointed to the distinct footprints leading away from the clearing. Massive, three-toed impressions embedded deep into the earth, disappearing into the jungle. Triceratops tracks. Daniel's stomach twisted. Riker followed the soldier's line of sight, his expression unreadable. He studied the tracks, then turned back to Daniel. You were tracking a juvenile, you said? Daniel forced himself to nod. Yes, alone, separated from its herd. Riker considered this for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he turned to his men and barked, search the perimeter. If the creature is still close, I want it found. Daniel's heart pounded. The soldiers spread out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. If they followed the tracks too far, they would find the Triceratops and her calf. And if that happened, Daniel acted on instinct. Riker, he said, stepping forward. You need to see this. Riker frowned, turning back to him. See what? Daniel gestured toward the fallen raptor. This isn't just any alpha. It's different, bigger, stronger. It might be part of a new subspecies. If we take it back now, we can study it properly before it wakes up. Riker hesitated. Daniel knew he had to press harder. If we wait too long, it'll be impossible to transport. The sedative won't last forever, and if it regains consciousness while we're out here, we'll lose control of the situation. Riker studied him carefully, then turned back to the soldiers. Forget the tracks, he ordered. Load up the raptor. We take it back immediately. Relief flooded Daniel's chest, but he kept his face neutral. The soldiers obeyed quickly, strapping the unconscious raptor onto a transport sled and securing it for the helicopter. Riker cast one final glance at the jungle before following them. Daniel stood motionless, listening to the sounds of the soldiers retreating, the blades of the helicopter roaring to life. Then, as the aircraft lifted off, carrying the alpha raptor away, silence fell over the jungle once more. He had done it. He had given them a chance to escape. Daniel let out a slow breath, then turned back toward the jungle, toward the place where the Triceratops had disappeared. Somewhere out there, she and her calf were still running, still surviving. And for now, that was enough. The jungle had gone silent in the wake of the departing helicopters. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the dense foliage where the Triceratops and her calf had disappeared. The distant hum of the aircraft was fading, but the weight of what had just transpired still pressed on his chest. He had successfully misled Riker and the rest of the retrieval team, but he knew it was only a temporary victory. The organization behind the expedition would not give up easily. They would send more teams better equipped with stronger intent to capture, or worse. If the mother and her calf were to have any real chance of survival, he would have to ensure they were far beyond the reach of the facility by morning. He checked his gear, ensuring he had everything he needed. His backpack contained minimal supplies, only a few protein bars, water, and a basic first aid kit. He had lost most of his heavier equipment during the earlier chase. What he had would have to do. Taking a deep breath, Daniel pressed his hand to the rough bark of a nearby tree, steadying himself. Then, with a final glance toward the distant lights of the facility, he stepped forward, following the deep footprints left behind in the mud. Each step took him deeper into the unknown. The jungle was alive again, rustling with nocturnal creatures moving through the undergrowth. Fireflies blinked in the humid air, their soft glow flickering between the branches. The scent of damp earth and blooming flora filled his lungs, grounding him in the moment. He followed the tracks for nearly an hour, moving cautiously, listening for any sign of the Triceratops. The deeper he went, the more the terrain changed. The soft jungle floor became uneven, littered with exposed roots and ancient stones. He could feel the shift in temperature too, cooler, as if he were descending into a valley. Then he heard it, a low, rhythmic huffing sound, almost like heavy breathing. Daniel slowed his pace, moving carefully toward the source of the noise. His heart pounded as he pushed through the last of the dense foliage and stepped into a small clearing. And there they were. The mother Triceratops stood tall, her muscular form partially illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees. Her calf was curled up beside her, nestled in the thick grass, its small frame rising and falling with each breath. The mother's eyes flickered toward Daniel, her nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. Daniel raised his hands, palms open, showing he meant no harm. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mother let out a soft, rumbling sound, half warning, half acknowledgement. She didn't charge, which meant she was beginning to recognize him as something other than a threat. Slowly, carefully, Daniel lowered himself to one knee, reducing his height. He knew sudden movements could startle her, and the last thing he wanted was to trigger a defensive reaction. The calf lifted its head, blinking sleepily. Its large, curious eyes locked onto Daniel, and after a moment, it let out a soft, chirping noise. Daniel felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just an animal. This was a living, breathing piece of history, a miracle of survival against all odds. "You're safe now," he murmured, barely audible over the gentle rustling of the trees. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. They weren't safe. Not yet. He needed to get them farther away from the facility's search perimeter before sunrise. But moving a full-grown Triceratops through dense jungle was no simple task. If they were spotted, there would be no convincing Riker a second time. He had to think fast. He scanned the area, searching for anything that could help. The terrain sloped downward to the west, leading toward what appeared to be a river. If they followed it, they could put more distance between themselves and the facility. But there were risks. Water sources attracted predators, and the jungle was filled with dangers, both known and unknown. Still, it was their best chance. Daniel rose slowly, never breaking eye contact with the mother. He took a few cautious steps back, then gestured toward the riverbank. "Come on," he urged softly. "We have to go." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, with deliberate grace, she lowered her head and nudged her calf, encouraging it to stand. Daniel exhaled in relief. They were going to follow him. As the trio made their way toward the river, the jungle watched in silence, bearing witness to the fragile alliance between man and beast, a bond forged in trust, bound by survival. But danger was never far behind, and as they disappeared into the shadows of the night, a pair of unseen eyes followed their every move. The night air was thick with humidity, wrapping around Daniel like a damp shroud as he guided the mother Triceratops and her calf toward the river. Every step they took was deliberate, their movements cautious but determined. The mother's heavy footfalls left deep impressions in the soft jungle floor, while the calf struggled to keep up, its smaller frame not yet built for endurance. Daniel moved ahead, brushing aside the thick vines and low-hanging branches that obstructed their path. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and nocturnal predators, a constant reminder that danger lurked just beyond their field of vision. But his focus remained on the two creatures behind him. They had to keep moving. The facility wouldn't stop looking for them, and Riker, who had nearly caught him earlier, wasn't the kind of man to let a valuable specimen slip through his fingers. As they approached the riverbank, Daniel paused, crouching low behind a fallen log. He signaled for the Triceratops to stop, though he doubted she understood his gesture. Still, she halted, her massive frame partially hidden by the foliage. The calf, sensing the tension, pressed itself against its mother's leg. Daniel scanned the area ahead. The river was wide, its waters reflecting the faint moonlight that managed to pierce through the dense canopy. The current wasn't too strong, but it was moving swiftly, a silent force carving through the jungle. Rocks jutted out along the banks, providing stable footing, but beyond that, the terrain became treacherous. If they followed the river, they could put miles between themselves and the facility by morning. But it also meant exposing themselves in open space. His mind raced, They couldn't afford to hesitate. He turned back to the mother Triceratops. "We have to go," he whispered. "Now." She blinked, her large, intelligent eyes reflecting the dim light. And then, as if understanding the urgency in his voice, she took the first step forward, moving toward the water. The calf hesitated. It sniffed the air, letting out a soft chirp, before reluctantly following. The moment their feet touched the water, the calf recoiled, startled by the sensation of the cold river against its skin. Daniel could see the panic in its eyes, the uncertainty of stepping into the unknown. He moved beside it, crouching slightly. "It's okay," he murmured, placing a reassuring hand on its side. "You can do this." The mother let out a low, guttural sound, her version of encouragement. And slowly, step by step, the calf waded in. The water reached up to Daniel's waist as he led them forward. The current tugged at him, but he held firm, navigating carefully around the slippery rocks. The mother Triceratops moved with surprising grace, her instincts guiding her. The calf, however, struggled, its movements clumsy. Daniel reached out, steadying it. For a moment, he marveled at the sheer impossibility of what was happening. A human guiding prehistoric creatures through a modern jungle, away from the grasp of a corporation that would exploit them, felt surreal. But reality came crashing back the moment he heard the distant sound of engines. Helicopters. His breath caught in his throat. They were coming, and they weren't alone.
A sharp rustling in the jungle behind them sent a wave of adrenaline through Daniel's veins. He turned, barely able to make out the shadows moving between the trees. At first he thought it was the retrieval team, but then he saw the eyes, glowing, predatory, not human. Something was stalking them. The mother Triceratops sensed it too. She let out a deep, rumbling growl, her stance shifting as she positioned herself between the threat and her calf. Daniel didn't have to guess what it was. Raptors. His pulse pounded as he reached for the small machete strapped to his belt. It was a pathetic defense against a pack of velociraptors, but it was all he had. The jungle fell eerily silent. The air was thick with tension. Then, a blur of movement. Daniel barely had time to react before the first raptor lunged from the foliage, its razor-sharp claws slashing through the air. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the lethal strike, and swung his machete instinctively. The blade caught the raptor's side, drawing a sharp cry of pain, but it wasn't enough to slow it down. The mother Triceratops roared. With a powerful swing of her head, she sent the raptor flying, its body crashing against a nearby tree with a sickening thud. But they weren't alone. Two more raptors emerged, their sleek bodies moving with lethal precision. They circled the trio, their intelligent eyes assessing their prey. Daniel's grip on his weapon tightened. They couldn't win a fight like this. Not against predators built for the hunt. The helicopters were getting closer. They had to run. "Go!" Daniel shouted, motioning toward the opposite riverbank. "Now?" The mother hesitated for only a second before obeying. She nudged her calf forward, pushing it ahead as she followed close behind. Daniel stayed at their flank, his eyes darting between the advancing raptors and the oncoming helicopters. They were out of time. The raptors lunged. But before they could reach their targets, a blinding spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the river. The deafening roar of the helicopter's rotors sent waves rippling across the water. The retrieval team had arrived. Chaos erupted. The raptors recoiled, their eyes flashing with sudden uncertainty. They weren't used to being the ones caught in the open. Daniel didn't waste a second. He grabbed onto the calf's side, guiding it faster through the water. The mother bellowed, moving with urgency, her powerful strides cutting through the current. Gunfire erupted from the helicopter. The raptors shrieked, darting back into the jungle, vanishing into the darkness. Daniel didn't look back. He kept moving, his entire body screaming in exhaustion. And then, they reached the other side. The mother Triceratops climbed onto solid ground, her calf right behind her. Daniel stumbled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They had made it. But as the helicopter hovered above them, its searchlight locking onto their position, he knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The helicopter's spotlight locked onto Daniel, the mother Triceratops, and her calf, its blinding beam illuminating the water droplets still clinging to their bodies. The deafening thrum of the rotors sent a gust of wind whipping through the trees, rustling the leaves in an eerie, unnatural dance. Daniel knew they had mere seconds before the retrieval team made their next move. The mother Triceratops let out a low, guttural growl, her instincts screaming danger. She positioned herself protectively in front of her calf, her eyes darting between the hovering machine and the jungle behind them. She wasn't the only one on edge. Daniel could see movement in the trees beyond the river. The raptors hadn't given up. They were circling, lurking just outside the reach of the helicopter's light, their predatory eyes gleaming in the shadows. Trapped between the corporation's mercenaries and the jungle's apex predators, their options were dwindling fast. Daniel had to think. Fast. A voice crackled through a loudspeaker, cutting through the chaos. Daniel Carter. Stand down. We know you have the specimen. He clenched his jaw. Riker. The lead hunter for the corporation. A man who had spent years tracking prehistoric creatures across the world for profit. He was ruthless, relentless, and utterly without mercy. This doesn't have to get ugly, Riker's voice continued. Step away from the assets and we'll let you walk away. No harm, no consequences. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, right? Riker didn't expect a response. It was all for show. A chance to make himself feel like he had control of the situation. Daniel's eyes flicked to the mother Triceratops. Her muscles were tense, ready to charge at the first sign of danger. He could use that. But a frontal attack would be suicide. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The calf pressed against Daniel's side, trembling. No, he wouldn't let them take her. He turned, scanning the jungle behind him. If they could break through the tree line, they might have a chance of losing the retrieval team in the dense underbrush. But the raptors, they were waiting. A new sound made his heart pound. A second helicopter. Coming in fast. Time was up. Daniel made a decision. He turned to the mother Triceratops, looking her straight in the eye. He didn't know if she could understand him, but he needed her to trust him. Run, he whispered. She hesitated for only a second. Then, with a deafening bellow, she turned and charged into the jungle, her calf scrambling to follow. Gunfire erupted. The mercenaries opened fire, bullets kicking up dirt and splintering tree bark. Daniel ducked low, sprinting after the Triceratops as fast as his legs would carry him. Branches snapped around him. The jungle closed in, thick and suffocating. Behind him, the retrieval team gave chase. But they weren't the only ones. A piercing screech echoed through the trees. The raptors. They had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with chaos unfolding, they made their move. The first raptor lunged from the shadows, claws outstretched. It was fast, too fast. Daniel barely managed to twist his body in time to avoid a direct hit. Instead, he felt the air shift as its claws sliced past his shoulder, a razor-thin miss. The mother Triceratops didn't hesitate. She spun on her heel and slammed her massive head into the attacking raptor, sending it flying into a tree. The impact was bone-crunching. The raptor let out a strangled cry before collapsing into the underbrush, unmoving. But the rest of the pack wasn't deterred. 3 more raptors burst from the foliage, their predatory eyes glowing in the darkness. The mercenaries, caught between the dinosaurs and their quarry, hesitated. Then, screams. Gunfire. The jungle erupted into a full-scale battle. The raptors turned on the retrieval team, seeing them as the bigger threat. The mercenaries, armed with high-tech rifles and body armor, fired back in a desperate bid to hold their ground. Daniel didn't stick around to watch. He grabbed a thick vine and swung himself over a fallen log, narrowly avoiding a snapping raptor jaw. His focus was on the mother Triceratops and her calf, who were crashing through the jungle ahead. He had to keep them moving. Gunfire crackled in the distance. The retrieval team was trying to fight off the raptors, but the dinosaurs had the advantage. They knew this jungle. A guttural roar split the air. The mother Triceratops had reached a clearing, a wide open space with nowhere to hide. Daniel cursed under his breath.
If they were caught here, it was over. He sprinted to the mother's side, panting. The calf nudged against him, frightened. Almost there, Daniel whispered, trying to reassure himself as much as the creatures. Then, a floodlight, blinding. The second helicopter had arrived. It hovered low, its downdraft flattening the grass and whipping dirt into the air. Through the haze, Daniel saw them. More mercenaries. He counted at least 6. They had anticipated his move. They were cornered. Riker's voice rang out once more. It's over, Carter. The mother Triceratops let out a warning growl, pawing at the ground. Daniel raised his hands slightly, trying to buy time. You don't have to do this, Riker. Don't insult me, Riker scoffed. This is business. That calf is worth more money than you can comprehend. Step aside. Daniel's heart pounded. They weren't going to let him walk away, and he wasn't going to let them take her. Then, a screech, ear-splitting, deafening. Daniel barely had time to react before something massive barreled into the clearing. The lead raptor, bloodied, angry. It had survived the battle in the jungle, and now it was here, its eyes locked on the mother Triceratops. But it wasn't alone. 2 more raptors emerged from the trees, circling the clearing. The mercenaries raised their weapons. The air was thick with tension. And then, chaos. The raptors struck first. They moved like lightning, leaping onto the nearest mercenary, tearing him down before he could even scream. Gunfire exploded. Daniel hit the ground, rolling beneath the mother Triceratops as bullets tore through the night. The mother roared, swinging her massive tail like a battering ram, knocking 2 mercenaries off their feet. The calf, terrified, darted toward Daniel. Riker fired his weapon, the bullet whizzing past Daniel's ear. He grabbed the calf and ran. The jungle was closing in around them again. Behind him, he could hear the battle raging. Screams, dinosaur roars, gunfire, and then silence. Daniel didn't stop running, didn't look back. The jungle swallowed them whole. They had escaped, but for how long?